Some days, I wonder, if I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone even notice? My name is Isabella Hart. I'm 29 years old. I live alone in a small attic apartment above an old bookstore, in a neighborhood where winter drags on too long and spring sunlight arrives late. Every morning, I wake up at 6, brew a cup of black coffee, and head out with the same worn-out canvas bag I've carried for almost 5 years. My day begins at Feather and Ink, a cozy little bookstore cafe that smells of fresh paper and dark roast espresso. There, I make coffee, wipe down shelves, rearrange displays, and scribble quiet notes into a pocket notebook when no one's looking. The tasks repeat themselves, but I never find them dull. Maybe it's the way people come looking for stories when they're lost. Or maybe it's because I believe every book, like every person, holds a truth waiting to be found. People recognize me. The quiet girl with the thoughtful eyes and a voice like early autumn wind. They say I'm sweet, attentive, someone easy to like. But no one really knows me, and I don't let them. By late afternoon, I return to my little red brick apartment with a window that faces a tangled alley of power lines and rooftop shadows. I turn on my desk lamp, open my laptop, and step into a different world. One where I'm not a barista, but someone following the threads of truth. I'm an investigative contributor for the New England Herald. No official title, no byline, just encrypted emails, hushed phone calls, and a case I've been quietly tracking for the past 7 months. They don't know who I am, and I'm not ready for anyone to find out. I don't do it for money or recognition. I do it because something inside me can't bear silence. Some part of me needs to believe that if I dig deep enough, long enough, something right will come to light. From the outside, my life looks ordinary. But in every flipped document, in every footnote I write, I feel myself slowly stepping out from the shadow I once hid behind. I'm no hero. I don't have superpowers. I'm just a girl who serves coffee by day and searches for light in the darkness by night. I used to think my life would only revolve around books, coffee, and nameless illustration submissions, with no room for anything sudden or fateful. Until the day he appeared. That morning, a light drizzle started early. Not strong enough to stop anyone, but persistent enough to seep into the skin, to make the wooden floor slippery, and to quiet the usual rhythm of the day. The shop was quiet. I was wiping a table when a sharp crash rang out. A glass shattered on the floor, followed by a body collapsing near the front door. Everything after that blurred, like a scene in slow motion. I rushed over and knelt down beside him. A young man, soaked in rain, pale skin, shallow breath. He wore a black shirt, a leather-strapped watch, long cold fingers, not someone homeless, not someone weak. I placed a warm towel on him, called an ambulance, and stayed by his side until the medics arrived. No one else in the shop said a word, but I knew they were watching. I didn't explain, and I didn't need a thank you. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next morning, he came back. This time, alert, composed. A light gray suit, neatly combed hair, the same watch on his wrist. He handed me a cup of chamomile tea and said thank you. His voice was low but warm. "I'm Ethan," he said, eyes steady and calm. I nodded, cautiously. He was polite, but too quiet for me to feel entirely at ease. Something about him made me want to keep my distance, and yet I wanted to stay longer than usual. We made small talk, about the shop, the tea, the books misplaced on shelves. He left after 10 minutes, but then he came back. A second time, then a third. Not suddenly, not insistently, but steadily, patiently, as if he knew that if he moved too fast, I would disappear. Each visit, we spoke a little more. About the places he had lived, about the sketches I had never submitted, about the invisible fear of standing in a crowd and not being seen. I didn't understand why I was telling him these things. I'd always been cautious, but his eyes never pressed. They only listened, quietly, without judgment. I don't believe in fate, but if parallel lines, ones that should never meet, can somehow cross paths, then maybe I stood at that intersection. On a rainy, blurry day, beneath the dim yellow lights of Feather and Ink, Ethan still came to the shop regularly. No calls, no appointments, but always at times when the cafe was quiet, when the afternoon light tilted through the glass window and the scent of herbal tea still lingered in the air. I wasn't sure when we had become familiar. All I knew was that every conversation, short or long, brought me a sense of calm, and I, someone usually guarded, had grown used to his presence like it was no longer unfamiliar. That day, while I was carefully mending the spine of an old book, Ethan stood by the shelf and quietly said, "There's an art exhibition this Saturday at the museum. I have 2 tickets. Would you like to come with me?" I froze, not because of the invitation, but because of how he said the word "with," gently, naturally, as if he didn't see any line between him and me, between this old bookstore and the world of oil paintings. I chuckled, a little awkwardly. I don't think I fit in places like that. Ethan simply smiled, said nothing more. He didn't insist. He didn't explain. He just moved on to another topic, as if whether I said yes or no wouldn't change anything between us. But that evening, when I got home, I kept thinking about it, about how he stood there, not overly confident, not hesitant either, about his eyes, like they saw something in me that I wasn't even sure existed. I opened my laptop and looked up the exhibition. A bright, sleek space, elegant people, photos with perfect lighting and colors. I wondered if I walked into that place, would anyone see that I didn't belong? And yet, the next morning, I still typed out a message. "If the invitation still stands, I'll come." Less than a minute later, he replied, "I'm really glad to hear that." I stared at the screen for a long while. Maybe I wasn't ready, but something inside me knew. It was time to step out of the little world I'd built for myself. I spent nearly an hour standing in front of my wardrobe. Even though I'd agreed to go with Ethan, I still didn't know what to wear to feel just enough. Not too flashy, not too out of place. In the end, I chose a pale pink silk dress, simple but well-fitted. I told myself, it's just an art exhibition. No one will really notice me. But the moment I stepped into the main hall of the art museum, I knew I was wrong. The atmosphere there felt like another world. Spotlights from the high ceiling, sparkling champagne glasses in hand, and women walking confidently in heels with smiles that knew exactly where they stood in the room. Ethan gently placed his hand on my back, a subtle, reassuring gesture. I smiled, nodded, and tried to steady my steps. I didn't want anyone to know I was nervous, especially when a young woman approached, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Ethan. She wore an emerald green dress, her hair in an elegant bun, lips a striking red. "Ethan, I thought you were still in Geneva." Then she turned to me. Her smile remained, but the warmth in her eyes vanished. I knew that look. Words weren't needed to feel the judgment. She didn't need to ask who I was, because in her eyes, I clearly didn't belong. Ethan introduced me. "This is Isabella, a friend of mine. We're here to see the exhibit together." I tried to smile. She did too, but this time, her lips only curved up just enough not to be rude. Later, as I passed a row of landscape paintings, I heard someone whisper behind me, "Who is that girl? She looks too plain." I stood for a long time in front of a painting I didn't really understand. I heard every word, and even though I was used to judgment, my chest still tightened a little. Only one person didn't make me feel out of place, an elderly woman with silver hair sitting near the window. She looked at me and gave a gentle smile. That smile was unlike anyone else's in the room. It held no arrogance, no pity, just a warm gaze, enough for me to keep standing tall, among all the eyes that said I didn't belong. I wasn't sure how long I'd been trying to stay composed. The exhibition felt like a polished dream. Beautiful, curated, but never meant for me. Ethan remained the same, gentle, reserved, always leaving just enough space so I wouldn't feel suffocated. We walked past rows of paintings, exchanging a few words as if everything was normal. But deep down, the lingering gaze from the green-dressed woman and those whispered comments still echoed in my chest. I told myself, just make it through tonight. Just a little longer, and I'd return to my own world. And then, an older man approached. He shook Ethan's hand naturally, patted his shoulder with familiar ease, and glanced at me briefly. There was no malice in his eyes, but something in me instinctively wanted to step back. Before I could move, he said, "Bringing your girlfriend to see the exhibit. Does Victor know? Or are you hiding her like the last times?" I froze. A short sentence, half joke, half truth. but it hit like a slap across the fragile calm I was clinging to. "Victor?" I looked at Ethan, hoping for a denial, but he remained silent. A few seconds passed before he finally said, quietly, "Victor Lockwood is my father." My throat went dry. I could hear my heart beat slow, then race like an alarm bell. Victor Lockwood. I knew that name too well. From news headlines, from confidential documents I once handled at the paper. Chairman of Lockwood Industries, the largest chemical conglomerate on the East Coast. A man repeatedly accused of dumping waste into rivers, bribing environmental inspectors, silencing entire departments. Untouchable. And Ethan, the man walking beside me, was his son. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside, everything cracked. Why hadn't he told me from the start? Why me, of all people? And the worst question of all, was anything between us ever real? Or was I just a piece in a game I never knew I was part of? I had intended not to see Ethan again after that exhibition. Not out of anger, but because I didn't know what to face in his eyes. Part of me wanted to believe what we had was real, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into the wrong story. Then, 2 days later, Ethan sent a message. "I know you've been avoiding me, but if possible, I'd like to invite you to my grandparents' 55th wedding anniversary. Not for appearances, just because I want you there." I stared at that message for 10 full minutes without replying. A family party, the Lockwood estate, another elite gathering, more eyes that could strip me bare with just one look. But then, I remembered the old woman's smile at the exhibition. I remembered the feeling of standing among strangers and still holding myself with a bit of pride. I replied, "If you don't mind the presence of an ordinary girl, I'll come." Ethan sent back a single heart emoji. No extra words. None were needed. 3 days before the party, I started to truly worry. I didn't own an evening gown, didn't know how to make small talk, didn't know how to walk properly in heels. I searched online, how to shake hands correctly at formal events. I tried brushing my hair into 3 different styles, and for the first time in years, I asked myself if I should wear a bit of lipstick. I didn't want to pretend to be someone else, but I also didn't want to walk into their house full of insecurity. If I was going, I wanted to go as an honest, but not fragile, version of myself. And then, the night before the party, I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. No longer just the girl from the bookstore, not yet part of that other world, but someone ready to walk into a place she's never belonged to. I arrived 10 minutes early. The car took me past the massive iron gate, down a lane lined with perfectly trimmed trees, and stopped in front of a white mansion that sat in the middle of an estate like something out of an old novel. I stepped out, took a deep breath, and tried to keep my hands from trembling as I adjusted the hem of my dress. I had borrowed it from a friend. Simple, ivory-colored, soft fabric, but not cheap-looking. Still, as I walked into the grand hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a place I didn't belong. The room sparkled with crystal chandeliers. Laughter echoed from all corners, glasses clinked gently, and the air held the faint trace of expensive perfume. Ethan greeted me at the entrance. He wore a black suit, poised and elegant, as if this party was just another routine part of his life. He smiled, extended his hand, and I took it, like it was the only solid thing I could hold on to in this unfamiliar world. We walked past clusters of people deep in conversation. Many eyes landed on me. Some offered polite nods, a few gave courteous smiles, but there were also quick glances that scanned me from head to toe, followed by subtle exchanges of looks between the guests. I knew those kinds of looks. No words were needed to guess what they were thinking. Who invited her? Who is she? Why is she here? I straightened my back, kept a light smile. Not too stiff, not too forced. I didn't want them to see how unsure I felt, even though inside, I was wrestling with 100 conflicting emotions. And then, at the far end of the room, I caught the gaze of a man standing by the grand fireplace. Victor Lockwood. He didn't look at me the way the others did. No hostility, no curiosity, just cold. A gaze so cold it felt like the temperature in the room dropped by a few degrees. I didn't know what he'd heard about me, but I knew, instantly, if anyone here didn't want me to be present, It was him. Soft classical music played in the background, blending with the clinking of glasses and polite laughter. But none of it reached me clearly anymore. The room was dazzling, luxurious. I stood in the middle of it like a mismatched detail, and from across the room, Victor Lockwood continued watching me without blinking. No tension, no visible anger, just absolute coldness. The kind of gaze from someone who'd spent a lifetime judging others without raising his voice. Ethan gently took my hand and led me toward a group of older guests. I recognized a few faces from financial news outlets. At the center stood Victor, commanding presence like a general who needed no armor. He gave me a brief glance before turning to his son. "Aren't you going to introduce her?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then said, "This is Isabella, a friend of mine." Victor raised an eyebrow, looking me over slowly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it made me feel like I was under a microscope. Then he spoke. "A simple girl, in a party that's anything but. That dress must have been borrowed from someone with better taste. But it's fine. My son has always had a thing for novelties, even if they're just temporary." The air around me seemed to freeze. Some guests looked away. Some forced polite smiles. Others pretended to focus on the wine in their hands. My throat went dry, not from surprise, but from the sting of being cut down in front of everyone. Ethan stood beside me, stunned. I could tell he was struggling with something, but in that moment, he said nothing, and that hurt more than the insult itself. I didn't cry. I didn't walk away. I simply pressed my lips together and gave a small nod, a response no one heard but me. If they thought silence meant weakness, they were wrong. Because in that very moment, I realized I didn't need anyone to defend me. I could stand on my own. I don't quite remember how I left the party, only that a freezing gust slapped my cheek as I stepped down the marble stairs, and the faint sound of classical music still echoed behind me, like the aftertaste of a strange dream. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just saw, more clearly than ever, I no longer wanted to stand on the sidelines. Ethan didn't text that night. No explanation. No sign of regret. Maybe he was confused. Or maybe he was choosing to stay silent like so many others had when they witnessed injustice and looked away. As for me, I had stood still long enough. The next morning, I returned to the bookstore on time. Same footsteps, same scent of roasted coffee, same familiar customers. Everything appeared unchanged, but inside me, something had shifted for good. After making the last cappuccino of the morning, I walked straight to the counter, opened my laptop, and clicked on the folder no one else knew existed. VL, Phase 2. It held everything. Records of untreated waste disposal, satellite images of the Eastern Industrial Zone, anonymous letters from factory workers, encrypted internal data, a list of suspicious payments tied to the names I saw at last night's party. I had collected it all over the past 7 months. What began as curiosity had grown into suspicion, and then a fire I could no longer extinguish. I couldn't keep ignoring it. I couldn't keep living a life defined by safety and smallness. I opened a new document, not a briefing for the newsroom, but a full investigative article, under my own name. Clear headline, verified numbers, sharp evidence, not a word wasted. I wrote for 2 straight hours. Every sentence was a needle piercing the polished mask of the Lockwood Empire. When I finished, I took a deep breath, placed my fingers on the send key, and pressed it. The editor's reply came just 15 minutes later. "Excellent. Legal will review. If it checks out, it's going on the front page tomorrow morning." I stayed seated for a long time after I closed the laptop, not to rethink anything, but to feel, for the first time in my life, I was no longer someone walking beside the game. I had stepped right into the center of it. The article appeared on the front page at 6 a.m. The headline didn't mention Lockwood Industries, didn't use the word accusation, and carried no sensational tone. But every line in it, sharp as a scalpel. "The Truth Beneath the River, an investigation into a chain of secret dumping in the Northeast." Author, Isabella Hart. I read the article in the kitchen, under the dim light of early morning. On the table was the cup of coffee I had just made, the streak of milk still unmixed. I didn't touch it. Each paragraph, each line landed like a punch. Not because of the content, I knew those things could be true, but because the one who wrote it was Isabella. She had been following my family for 7 months. When I told her about the wrongs I saw in the industry, about the dreams I hadn't had the chance to fulfill, about how I wanted to escape the shadow called Lockwood, she had been quietly redrawing the entire map of my family's crimes, evidence, witnesses, even things I had never known existed. I felt hollow, both angry and hurt, as if someone had just torn open my chest, not to harm me, but to show me where my heart truly lay. A part of me screamed, "She betrayed you. She approached you with a purpose." But the rest said nothing. It just sat there, heavy and silent, like me, when I stayed quiet at that banquet. The sound of a chair sliding came softly behind me. My grandmother sat down, holding a folded newspaper in her hand. She didn't look at me right away. She simply laid the paper on the table, her fingers tapping lightly on its edge, as if keeping rhythm to an old tune. Finally, she asked, "Are you angry because she wrote the article, or because she was right?" I looked at her, unable to speak. She only smiled. No judgment, no surprise, as if this article was something she had been waiting for a very long time. The truth doesn't hurt people. What hurts is living too long in lies, and then being forced to wake up. I buried my head against the table, helpless. No longer Ethan Lockwood, the promising heir. Just a man who had lost something, truer than anything he had ever owned. I didn't expect silence after the article, but neither did I think the storm would come so fast. Less than 3 hours after the piece hit the front page, the newsroom's inbox was flooded with responses. Some were thank you notes, short, anonymous, coming from small towns around the industrial zone. But the rest were accusations, made up to get attention. Gold digger failed, so she turned to smearing her boyfriend's family. She's just a café worker. What does she know about investigations? Line after line appeared under every shared post. In just one afternoon, I went from a nobody to a name mentioned across finance and society discussion groups. They dug up old photos of me, dissected my fashion, my hometown, my education. One news site even published a photo of me standing in front of the bookstore with the headline, "From waitress to the one who brought them down. What is the real story of Isabella Hart?" I read everything, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know what I was up against. At times, I broke down in tears, not out of regret, but from feeling so small against the crashing waves. I walked around the neighborhood for nearly an hour, leaving my phone behind just to let my heart settle a little. But then I returned, sat back down in the familiar corner of the bookstore, opened the manuscript again, and read every line of the article I had written myself. Not a single word did I wish to take back. Not a single sentence was written on impulse. I had checked, cross-checked, verified, revised again and again. I didn't write to take revenge. I wrote because there are truths that need to be called by their right name. Late in the afternoon, the editor called me. His voice was steady. "Legal has reviewed it. We're keeping the article, and we stand with you." I sat for a long time after that call. Outside, the rain began to fall. I didn't run for cover like everyone else. I just stood there, looking through the glass, strangely calm inside. I knew the real storm was only just beginning. But after everything, I also knew something clearer than ever. I would not back down. I knew he would not stay silent. Victor Lockwood was not the kind of man to let himself be smeared and then quietly fade into the shadows. And my article, though it never named him outright, was still a slap across the face of the reputation he had built for nearly half a century. Not even 24 hours after the article went live, a legal statement from Carson & Fellman, the law firm representing Lockwood Industries, arrived at the newsroom. Its tone was sharp, precise. I was a defamer. The article was a product of deliberate fabrication. They demanded a retraction and a public apology. If not, the lawsuit would proceed in earnest. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. From somewhere, a swarm of fake accounts began to appear on social media. They reposted photos of me working at the bookstore, attaching anonymous stories with sneering captions. "A waitress with a dream of toppling an empire? How much was she paid for that fantasy?" Perfect script. date the tycoon's son, then pretend to expose his father. The climax came when a private message between me and Ethan was leaked. Nothing truly damning, but enough for anyone inclined to twist it, to claim I had approached Ethan not out of love, but for my own motives. I didn't know if Victor himself had pulled the strings. Perhaps he didn't need to. A man like him, one nod, and the whole machine moved. The newsroom kept the article. I kept working, but every step outside felt like walking among a pack of hidden wolves. There were nights I jolted awake from dreams, unable to recall what I had seen. Only the heavy weight in my chest, my heartbeat racing, the cold pressing in. It wasn't fear, it was clarity. The truth, however bright, will always provoke those who live in the dark to strangle it. Ethan no longer came to the bookstore. Since the article, there had been a long silence between us, not out of anger, but because neither of us yet knew how to go on. I didn't blame him, and I didn't expect forgiveness. That article was my choice. Even if it cost me the most fragile thing between us, I had no regrets. I heard he had temporarily withdrawn from the board of directors. The Lockwood family saw it as cowardice or betrayal, but I knew, for Ethan, it was a blow to the very roots of the faith he had carried. Since childhood, he had been raised in an environment of discipline, of pride in the Lockwood lineage. Victor was not a gentle father, but he was an untouchable monument. Standing before the truth I had published, Ethan was like a mirror cracked, not only in pain, but no longer sure what to reflect. I could picture him walking for hours in the familiar park, watching strangers pass, unable to stop asking himself, if my father truly is like that, then who am I? Once I received a short email from Ethan, just a single line. If I ever hurt you because I didn't trust enough, then I hope one day I can make it right. I read it at midnight. My eyes stung, not from pain, but from sorrow. Sorrow for a love that had once been so beautiful. Sorrow for a man standing between two roads, love and the very roots of his life. But I understood. A man like Ethan needed time, not to choose me, but to find himself again, after the shell of faith he had lived in had begun to fracture. The storm didn't come from just one direction. After the article, I was no longer the anonymous girl behind the coffee counter, no longer the quiet one writing under the soft glow of warm lights and gentle music each night. I suddenly became the center of attention, but not in a radiant spotlight, rather in a flood of doubts, attacks, and bitter mockery. Who does she think she is, going after the Lockwoods? Another gold digger craving fame? A bookshop waitress? What would she know about running a chemical empire? I read each headline like someone staring into a warped mirror. I didn't protest. I didn't explain. I just felt sad. Not because they misunderstood, but because they didn't want to understand. One evening, while closing up, a couple walked into the shop. The woman glanced at me, whispered something to her friend. They both laughed. I smiled anyway, served them like anyone else. But inside, something cracked. Slow, quiet, but real. I knew I had touched a force more than just wealthy, a machine that knew how to twist the narrative. They had money, influence, media connections, and me? I had one article, one truth, and a heart slowly bleeding. I once believed that when truth was revealed, justice would follow. But even the strongest truth can't silence megaphones already screaming in all directions. I started to doubt myself. Had I been naive? Had I underestimated the fallout? Was I losing? That night, I sat alone on the balcony, staring at the distant city lights. I didn't cry. I just felt hollow, like I was slowly disappearing from the very story I had written. And yet deep down, I clung to one fragile belief, that if even one person still believed in me, I wasn't truly alone. When I thought I was slowly disappearing inside the very story I was writing, a small signal suddenly appeared. It was an email from a strange address with a short subject line. I used to work at Lockwood Group. At first glance, I thought it was just a cruel joke, or worse, a trap set up to knock me down once more. But the more I read, the faster my heart pounded, my hand trembling slightly. The sender introduced himself as an engineer who had once worked at the waste processing facility, but resigned after being threatened into silence. He didn't say much about himself, only about unusual shifts, altered records, and even a dumping incident he had been forced to witness. Attached to the email was a recording. The hum of industrial fans droned on, mixed with a curt exchange between two male voices. One of them, I heard clearly, mentioned Mr. Victor with a fearful clarity. I put on my headphones, listening 5-6 times over. Not to verify further, but to remind myself this wasn't an illusion. I had truly found an ally. That night, I broke down in tears. Not out of weakness, but because after days of being mocked and stoned with words, I finally heard a voice stand on my side. A stranger, yet he handed me the trust I thought had run dry. I replied with all my gratitude, promising to protect his identity. And when he wrote back, "I just want the truth to be heard," I knew I was no longer alone. A few days later, while rearranging old books on the shelf, I found a small envelope slipped into the cafe's mailbox. Inside was only a single piece of paper, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. "Proud of you." No signature, but I knew it was Ethan's grandmother. I sat still for a long time, my hand gently clutching the paper. That letter did not silence the noise outside, nor could it stop the storm of public opinion. But it lit a small lamp inside me. Because sometimes, just one quiet faith is enough to keep a person standing firm in the darkness. That short letter was like a tiny candle in a dark room. And then, another flame suddenly flared up, illuminating the bleak sky I was walking through. One morning, I received a thick packet of documents from the engineer who had contacted me earlier. This time, it wasn't just scattered accounts or recordings. It was a hard drive full of data. Water sample analyses, on-site photos, internal emails, and most important of all, a direct video recording. In it, Victor Lockwood stood in the middle of the coastal plant, giving a firm order. "Dump it all, before sunrise." His face appeared clearly on camera, undeniable. No more rumors, no more fragmented pieces. This was the key that could burst open the sealed door. My hands trembled as I pressed replay. Not out of fear, but because I knew this moment would change everything. If published, there would be no way back. But at the same time, the silent victims of so many years would finally have a voice. I spent the whole afternoon by the window, watching the rain fall off the eaves, trying to steady myself. Each drop hitting the tiles reminded me of rivers stained with toxins, abandoned lands, and the quiet endurance of countless people. This was no longer just my story, or the Lockwood family's. It had become the story of thousands. When I brought the data to the newsroom, I saw the editor's eyes light up, a light of conviction. He didn't need to ask further. He only said, "We'll show the whole world." That night, I sat alone in the bookstore, closing earlier than usual. I didn't write, nor did I read. I only looked around the small room, the bookshelves, the familiar tables and chairs, the faint scent of coffee. All of it seemed to carve itself into my memory, like a final place of peace before the real storm arrived. I knew that tomorrow, when the video was released, there would be no more room for silence. The door had opened, and the truth could no longer be buried. When the video was broadcast, the atmosphere shattered like glass breaking into thousands of pieces. No more circular arguments, no more chance for excuses. The image of Victor Lockwood ordering the dumping spread across every news outlet, appearing on phone screens, on morning TV reports, even on makeshift posters people plastered around the industrial zone. The name Lockwood was no longer tied to power, but to outrage. The corporation's stock plummeted. Within 3 days, nearly half its market value evaporated. The very partners who once shared lavish banquets now unanimously declared they were suspending cooperation pending the investigation. International media jumped in, comparing Lockwood Industries to the great environmental disasters that had shaken history. I sat silently before the screen, following every line of updates. In my eyes, a massive empire, once seemingly untouchable, was splintering apart, loud and violent. But amid the shock, one thing chilled me more than anything else: the chaos within their own family. The cousins who once laughed and chatted in front of me at the exhibition were now openly criticizing Victor. Some even quietly filed lawsuits, hoping to separate themselves from the tightening legal noose. In press photos, I saw Victor's wife standing quietly behind him, her face stiff like a cracked statue. Ethan, meanwhile, vanished from the public eye. I heard he had left the mansion, no longer living with the family. Rumors said he refused to sign the statement defending the corporation and would not speak out to justify his father. People called it betrayal, but I knew it was only the first step in the journey he was forced to take. I folded the newspaper and set it down on the table. The small room around me was still quiet, but inside, my heart shook without pause. I knew the storm hadn't ended here. These were only the first fractures, heralding an inevitable collapse. From the cracks, the wall finally collapsed. Just 1 week after the video was released, the federal prosecutor officially announced Victor Lockwood was indicted on multiple charges, from environmental destruction, bribery of officials, to concealing evidence. The news spread like fire meeting wind, and for the first time, the name Lockwood was no longer spoken with reverence, but in the whispered contempt of the public. Victor's image on television screens left many stunned. No longer a powerful tycoon in a perfectly tailored suit, standing tall and proud. Instead, he was a withered man, gaunt-faced, hair gray and disheveled, eyes darting away. He was escorted out of the mansion that had once symbolized opulence, his wrists shackled in shining cuffs under the flash of cameras. In court, Victor still tried to keep a calm tone. He claimed the video was doctored, that all the documents were nothing but the work of disgruntled individuals. He even blamed hostile media forces. But every word of defense only fueled more outrage. No one believed him anymore. Not a single person. Each denial spilling from his mouth was like a blade shredding the mask of the untouchable tycoon he had so painstakingly built over decades. The major newspapers unanimously called it a symbolic collapse. From the height of power, Victor fell straight into the abyss of disgrace. Swift, cold, with nothing to cling to. I followed the constant news updates on the small screen in the bookstore. My heart was in turmoil. Part of me felt relief, because at last, justice had found its way. But mingled in was a quiet sorrow. For Ethan, for his grandmother, for the family members who had not committed the crimes yet were dragged into the storm. This downfall did not just bury an empire, it tore apart the lives orbiting around it. That night, as the final report replayed the scene of Victor being escorted into the car, I sat alone in the silent bookstore. The rain outside pounded heavily against the eaves, like urgent drumbeats. I thought about the path I had walked, about the price truth forces people to pay. There is no victory that is entirely complete, but at least I knew the silence had been broken, and light, however fragile, had found its way through the darkness. When Victor fell, I thought everything would feel lighter. But the truth wasn't that simple. Between Ethan and me, there was still a silent gap. We hadn't seen each other since the day his father was arrested. I was busy with interviews, endless emails from the newsroom, and the attacks that had yet to fade away. As for him, he vanished from the media, leaving no trace except for scattered rumors that he had left the mansion, that he no longer attended the corporation's emergency meetings. I didn't blame him. I didn't wait for him either. I only saw clearly that, in the whirlwind of truth, each of us had to find ourselves again, in our own way. At night, sitting in the quiet bookstore, I often remembered the moment I received that short email from him. A simple line, yet it brought tears to my eyes. If I ever hurt you because I didn't trust enough, then I hope one day I can make it right. I read that sentence over and over, like a wound that hadn't closed. During those days, I returned to my writing. No more earth-shattering investigations, no more noisy battles. I wrote short essays for the culture column, writing about city mornings, about the smell of coffee, about sunlit streets. Simple things that helped me fill the emptiness inside. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still saw Ethan's silhouette. He walked slowly, his eyes weary yet filled with regret. I wanted to call his name, but my throat went dry. We only stood there, looking at each other from a distance, like two souls lost at a crossroads, neither daring to take the first step. Perhaps love doesn't always end with an argument. Sometimes it quietly ebbs away, like the tide, leaving behind a distance that only time can answer, whether it can be bridged or whether it will forever remain a crack. That silence wasn't mine alone. Somewhere else in the city, Ethan was also learning how to walk his own new path. I heard he had officially left Lockwood Industries. Not temporarily, not as a pause, but as a decisive choice, to give up his inheritance, to give up his seat on the board, to give up the fortune so many people dreamed of. The news stirred public opinion. Some praised him for his courage, others mocked him as a coward who ran away. But I understood. This was his way of choosing freedom for himself. One afternoon, by chance, I came across a small piece in the local paper. Not a headline, just a few short lines in the society section. Ethan Lockwood establishes the Green Light Foundation, aiming to restore environments contaminated by chemicals. I stared at those words for a long time, my heart tightening. He was no longer running away. He was beginning something new, not under his father's shadow, but under his own light. I pictured him in a simple shirt, walking along the riverbanks, talking with farmers who had lost their crops to poisoned water. He listened to them, quietly taking notes, not with the attitude of a Lockwood looking down from above, but with the humility of a man trying to make amends. Perhaps this was how he chose to prove his love. Not with promises, not with a reckless gesture and a drunken night, but with an enduring action, an action tied to the truth I had chosen to reveal. Reading that news, my nose stung. I knew that to reach this decision, he had to tear away the layers of old beliefs he had clung to all his life. And for Ethan, that was harder than facing his father. Knowing that Ethan had chosen to stand on the side of truth, it felt as if an invisible thread inside me had been released. The doubt, the hurt, they were still there, but no longer as sharp as before. I began to believe that between us, there was still a road on which we could find each other again. I didn't rush to seek him out. I didn't send a single message. I let time heal the cuts, let the silence turn not into a chasm, but into a bridge that could bring us back together. Then, one afternoon, Ethan appeared at the bookstore door. He stood there for a long time, as if wondering whether I still wanted to open my heart. No expensive suit, no image of a Lockwood heir. He was just an ordinary man, with weary eyes that carried a spark of resolve. He stepped inside, stopped at the counter, his voice trembling softly. "I'm sorry." 2 short words, but they carried all the nights he had wrestled within himself, all the regret of not standing by me when I needed him most. I stayed silent. In that moment, memories surged back. The extravagant exhibition, the banquet filled with scrutinizing stares, the days I was engulfed by public judgment, and that brief email he once sent. All of it unspooled like a slow-motion reel, forcing me to face it. Finally, I nodded. Not immediate forgiveness, but an acceptance that we had both been wrong, both been hurt, yet still wanted to move forward. We sat together in that familiar small corner, surrounded by the warmth of coffee and the glow of soft yellow light. There were no grand promises, only a slow, honest conversation, like 2 people beginning again from the start. I knew the crack hadn't disappeared, but it was through those very cracks that light would shine in. And this time, we chose to walk together, toward tomorrow. A year had passed since the day Victor Lockwood was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. That time wasn't enough to erase all the wounds, but enough to turn them into scars, reminding me that no matter how thick the darkness, it can never cover the light forever. This morning, Ethan and I walked into the hall of an international environmental conference. The lively chatter, the rows of chairs draped in white cloth glowing under the ceiling lights made me recall, for a moment, the extravagant parties of the Lockwood family. Back then, I had only been an outsider, but today, I was here as the co-founder of the Green Light Foundation, a title I had never dared to dream of. I brushed my fingers lightly across the badge around my neck. Isabella Hart, co-founder. My heart pounded. From a bookstore girl, I had come this far, not by luck, but through choices filled with loss, yet ultimately right. Ethan walked beside me, simple in a gray suit. He no longer bore the aura of an heir, but the calm of a man who had learned how to stand firm after the storm. He leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "I once thought I would lose everything, but it turns out, only when you let go of what isn't real, do you have room to hold what truly matters." I squeezed his hand, needing no further words. In that moment, I saw clearly we had found a new foundation to move forward together. The conference began. Speakers shared projects on environmental restoration across the globe. Forests reborn, rivers and lakes cleaned, communities reclaiming hope. Each story was a small lamp contributing to the greater light. Then it was my turn. I stepped onto the podium, the spotlight tilting my heart for a beat. But my voice grew steadier. I spoke about my journey, not as a journalist, not as a hero, but as an ordinary person who once trembled when standing alone against immense power. I spoke of rivers turned strange colors, of dry coughs echoing in factories, of the long nights I sat writing in fear. And I spoke of love, a love that seemed broken, but ultimately became the strength that carried me forward. When I finished, the hall fell silent for a moment, then broke into long applause. I looked down and saw Ethan smiling, his eyes glowing as if he, too, had just found himself again. In that moment, I knew we had stepped into a new world, a world where love was no longer a chain, but a strength, a world where light, after so many times losing its way, had finally found the path home. As the applause in the hall slowly faded, I suddenly realized the path I had taken had come full circle. A year ago, I was just an ordinary girl, living quietly between a small bookstore and night drawing lessons. I had never thought I would dare confront a powerful empire, much less stand on the stage of an international conference. But it was the choice not to back down that brought me here, even though the road was paved with wounds. I remembered it all. The mornings of making coffee with trembling hands, serving customers while secretly jotting down details for my investigation. The long nights at the old wooden desk, yellow lamplight falling over the manuscript. Each word I typed, weighing heavily on my heart. The moment of being humiliated in public at a glittering banquet, and the moment of standing up, speaking the truth before the stunned eyes of dozens. I remembered the days when I thought I had collapsed, when the public hurled stones, when I was called an opportunist, when walking down the street felt like every eye was watching with suspicion. And I remembered the small moments that held me up. An email from an anonymous engineer, a trembling handwritten note from Ethan's grandmother, or simply an encouraging smile from a stranger reader. They were as thin as threads, but they were the very threads that kept me standing. Now, looking back, I realized the truth can be buried, but it can never be erased forever. Like a seed hidden under dry soil, it will always find a way to sprout when light filters in. I once thought human dignity was measured by fame, by the recognition of the crowd. But after everything, I understood. Dignity doesn't lie in how much wealth we have or where we stand in the eyes of others. It lies in whether we have the courage not to turn our backs on the truth. Ethan squeezed my hand as we left the hall. Outside, the sky was clear after the night's rain. The first rays of sunlight fell across the stone steps, glittering bright. I drew a deep breath, feeling a rare peace within. This journey had taken much from me, but it had also given me something greater, the faith that light always waits behind the darkness, and that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, and silence is no longer destiny. I smiled and stepped forward toward tomorrow. What?